Constitutional recognition of Aboriginal Australians. Yes, this is a really heavy topic with many sentiments and emotions surrounding it. But first, to understand such a complex issue, we must have a knowledge of the history, so let's recap. Upon arrival to Australia in 1770, Captain Cook and his crew did not deem the Aboriginal people as, well, people. He decided that the natives had no ownership of the land because there was no written law and there were no signs of cattle, making them, quote, wild beasts to the settlers. It was under this basis that Australia was declared terra nullius, which translates to no man's land. This imprimis became the moral and legal basis by which Governor Arthur Phillip could declare English law to be the law of the land. Whilst the apparent racism and injustice of the decision can now be seen in modern society, British law still remains the force law within the colony. So this is basically where it begins. The system of Indigenous laws that govern Native Australians for many, many years are disregarded based on the opinions of these British colonies. And you may be asking yourself, okay, well, what does that matter? That's in the past. What does that have to do with treaties? What does that have to do with today? But the truth is that all current laws surrounding today, like a parking fine, for example, all result from that one decision, which demonstrates just how powerful colonisation is. It is clear that this decision has damaged Aboriginals and has impacted them for a long time. The current system does not allow for Aboriginal opinion and therefore causes an overall feeling of oppression and helplessness within the community. Whilst having to mourn for stolen children and recover from a mass genocide, Aboriginal people are actually being ignored by a system, therefore reminding them of their subservience to the British system and reinforcing the idea of white Australia. Furthermore, it's clear that when Australians think of national pride, that Indigenous ideas or culture is not widely included within this nation's identity. This funnels down to even the Australian flag, where the Union Jack is a key definer of what Australian culture is. This is why the constant battle to have Aboriginals heard and supported has perpetuated into today's conversation. The desire to make Aboriginal culture Australian again has been more wanted than ever. People are beginning to realise that it is not a coincidence that Aboriginal people experience things such as poorer health, higher levels of unemployment, lower levels of education, poorer housing, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of incarceration, and higher rates of recidivism. And this is why more than ever the Australian public desires law reform regarding the Aboriginal people. See, if we look at this timeline, we can see some of the past steps that has led to the overwhelming opinion that a treaty is necessary. Most predominantly comes the Mabo case, where in 1992 the High Court rejected the idea that terra nullius status existed, leading to the acceptance that Australia was in fact inhabited wrongfully. However, this case did not call into question the validity of the settlement and receipt of British law into Australia. Then there was the 1999 preamble referendum, which basically ruled out the possibility of constitutional recognition and swayed more people to a treaty. There was only a 39% yes vote, and it's clear why. Aboriginals were against the vote because it was highly symbolic and did not give any strength or practicality to the Aboriginal community. It was also seen by the First Nations as just a pure formality and wouldn't actually provide any guidelines to help the people. Then in 2008, Kevin Rudd held a national apology where he apologised for the stolen generations. This effectively created an overall awareness and healing within the Australian public. And it was also seen as the starting point for a lot of future activism. However, it was also recorded that this apology, whilst being symbolic, only apologised for the stolen generations and not the overall mistreatment of the First Nations. And for Aboriginal Australians, this was only the beginning of a reconciliation process. In fact, right now, Indigenous children in care have doubled since this Stolen Generations apology. Therefore, bringing us to the argument of a treaty. A treaty is basically a non-binding agreement that a parliament or whatever government body will sign to ensure that its laws are in cohesion with that document. The Uluru Statement of 2017 intended to have this effect. However, the government issued no official response, and fast forward to now, there has been no further attempt on the government's end to further this agreement or even reconcile. But the wish for a treaty, or makarata, is still stronger than ever. Such a document will adversely impact the Indigenous community for the better. Whilst provisions such as the implementation of the Koori Court today has helped to emerge Aboriginal culture into the lawmaking system, a treaty that will be agreed upon by the federal government will allow the Aboriginal people to feel like the government is actively trying to heal past wounds and is taking steps to not only acknowledge Aboriginal setbacks, but actually help balance them. Furthermore, such a treaty will allow for easier social cohesion, as the common day Australian people will be able to recognise the Indigenous people as an authority to which their laws will have to pass, and not just see them as an afterthought. Additionally, it will allow the First Nations cultures and ideas to be more easily merged with Australian life, hence creating more of an acceptance and awareness of Indigenous culture and further a larger support for the Indigenous community. However, it is also ignorantly argued that such provisions will unfairly entitle Indigenous populations to monetary compensation, and that's been the reason for most of the delay in the right-wing politics. Furthermore, there's been some argument that the treaty, upon being signed by the government, will bind future generations. For example, Paul Coe raises the argument that once terms are negotiated, that the descendants of the present generation may be stuck in a position that compromises their power and control. However, despite these proposed negative events a treaty may have on the wider population, it's clear that such a document will not be made to have the purpose of restricting the average Australian person, but will rather aim to allow a fair go for Indigenous Australians. Nor does it aim to replace the complex system in place, and it wouldn't be possible for it to, but will only act as another guideline for Parliament to consider. It would not be made to advantage the First Nations people, but it would only seek to balance the disadvantage that they have already suffered. A treaty will not alleviate all issues in the Indigenous community, and it shouldn't aim to. But by making a treaty and by agreeing to a treaty, we will set a trend of commitment to implementing change and setting priorities.